Chapter 1. Ruth Arbuckle sat at her desk, looking at the ledgers in front of her. She'd never really had the opportunity to attend school, but her mother had taught her as much as she could at home, and she could do enough ciphering to know there was something very wrong with the bookkeeping in front of her. When her husband had died 6 months before, she'd been left in charge of his vast ranch, and she had no idea how to properly run it. She'd kept her husband's foreman on, thinking he would do a good job for her and keep the ranch running. Unfortunately, though the ranch seemed to be running as well as ever, there were discrepancies in the books, and on paper at least, it was losing money. She was sure Bradley, the foreman, had been pocketing a great deal of the profits. Though she knew she needed to bring in someone she could trust, she had no idea how to go about it. She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her hands over her eyes. A widow at 22, she was in an isolated area with no prospects for the future. It was an hour each way if she just wanted to attend church or go to the local mercantile to post a letter. Surely there was an easier way to find a man who could come in and run the ranch the way it was meant to be run. Ruth pulled the local paper toward her and saw an ad that struck her as a possibility. It was an advertisement to find wives for lonely men. If a wife could be found for a man, why couldn't a husband be found for a lonely widow? She pulled out a pen and paper and quickly wrote out a letter. Hopefully someone would be willing to move all the way out to Wyoming to take on a young widow and a ranch. Only time would tell. She pushed the long blonde curls that had fallen out of her bun away from her face and stood up. She'd have to drive the letter into town to be mailed today. Ruth needed someone fast. Asterisk. Sebastian Miller sat in his tiny office in the back of the bank checking over the ledgers from the previous day. His entire job consisted of numbers. He didn't know how or why, but he had a gift with numbers that few others had or even understood. If he was given a string of numbers, he could add them up quickly in his head almost instantaneously. He loved what he did, but he needed more variety. Spending day after day in a dingy back office was not what he was meant to do. He thought of his brothers who all were able to spend as much time out of doors as they wanted, and he was jealous. Very jealous. If he could spend 1 day per week inside working with numbers, and the other 6 outside, he would be in his very own version of heaven. He sighed and moved on to the next ledger, his body aching to be outside. His job paid well, though, and he was happy to have extra money to save for his future, though he had no idea what that future would be. Every time a young lady caught his eye, her father would refuse his suit. They all had a problem with him for the misdeeds of his youth. When his older sister Elizabeth knocked on his open office door, he smiled and jumped to his feet, taking the infant from her arms. He loved to play uncle to all of his siblings' children. He was one of the middle siblings of a huge family, and he loved each and every one of his brothers and sisters dearly. Even if they had all been nicknamed the Demon Horde by locals. "This is a great surprise, Lizard Breath. What brings you to my dingy office in the middle of this fine afternoon?" Elizabeth shook her head at him. "I can't believe you still use that horrid nickname you gave me. You're a pain in my backside, Sebastian." "I think it's a great nickname. It's always suited you well." He sat down behind his desk with the baby in his arms and nodded toward the only other chair in his office. "Sit down and tell me why you're here. And don't tell me you don't need an excuse to visit me, because you've never been here before, and I've worked here for 5 years." Elizabeth laughed, folding her hands properly on her lap. Elizabeth was always proper, but it suited her and her station in life. She ran a matchmaking business out of the biggest house in town, which had been handed over to her by its previous owner, along with the business. "You're right. I'm here for a reason." She fidgeted a little, obviously not sure how to say what she wanted to say. "What's wrong? You're not sick, are you?" He looked at her for a moment, taking stock. Her cheeks were as rosy as ever, and she looked as if motherhood agreed with her. The infant in his arms certainly wasn't suffering if she was ill. I'm perfectly fine. She took a deep breath. I have a proposition for you. You shouldn't go around propositioning men, Elizabeth. You're a married woman. Besides, I'm your brother. She rolled her eyes at him. He'd always known how to make her act like a child. She pulled a letter from her reticule and pushed it across the desk to him. I received this letter today. I think you're the right person to respond. Sebastian frowned. Me? Her business involved sending women out to marry lonely men. He'd only heard of 2 instances where she'd sent men out, and they'd both been his brothers. He picked up the letter, not even certain he wanted to read the contents. You. As I read the letter, it seemed to scream your name to me. I think you need to respond. Quickly. He stood and handed the baby back to her before opening the letter and reading it through. To whom it may concern. I'm in need of a husband. I realize that you are not in the habit of sending men out to marry women, but my situation is unique, and I'm hopeful you can find a man who will suit my needs. My name is Ruth Arbuckle, and I'm a 22-year-old widow. I married young, and my husband was much older. He passed away 6 months ago, leaving me his ranch to run. I know nothing about running a ranch, so I kept his foreman on, and he is continuing to do the job my late husband hired him to do. As I go over the ledgers, though, it seems that money is missing. I have a feeling he is pocketing all the profits from the ranch. I need a man who can not only run this ranch as foreman, but he needs to be good with numbers and able to find where the missing money is. I'm considered nice-looking with blonde hair and green eyes. I keep a clean house, and I'm a decent cook. I just need someone to continue to run the ranch and carry on my late husband's legacy. If you can find that man for me, I need him here as soon as he can be sent. I've enclosed a bank draft for your fees and enough money for a train ticket and travel expenses. I live in a rural area of Wyoming. The nearest stores and church are in Douglas, which is an hour away, by horseback. Thank you for considering my situation. Ruth Arbuckle. Sebastian read the letter once more, thinking about what it would mean. He could do the bookkeeping work he enjoyed, but he would be outdoors most of the time. His mind was spinning with the possibilities. I want to go. Normally he weighed out every decision with precision. This one was simple. He had to do it. Elizabeth looked excited. I thought you would. You don't need to live your life in a tiny office, Bastian. I don't want to either. Could I leave Saturday? He was certain the excitement was creeping into his voice. Most people write back to the person asking for a spouse, but I think in this case, that would be perfect. He smiled and nodded. I'm going to go tell Mr. Anton that it's my last week here. He knew the bank manager would be disappointed because he could do the work of 3 other men with his arithmetic abilities, but for once in his life, he needed to do what was best for him. Elizabeth got to her feet. What do you need from me? I have the directions on how to get to her ranch. Anything else? Nope. I'll jump on a train and find her when I get there. How hard can it be? Sounds good. Come see me this evening, and I'll give you the directions and a home-cooked meal. Sounds good. I'm sick of eating at the diner. Sebastian lived in a little rooming house near the bank, and he was responsible for finding his own meals. He was very excited at the prospect of moving and having a real home. And a wife. His life was about to change drastically, and he couldn't be happier about it. Asterisk. Armed with his belongings in 2 small carpet bags and directions to get to the ranch once Sebastian reached Douglas, Wyoming, he said goodbye to his family and everything he'd ever known on Saturday. It would be a long journey, but at least he wouldn't be required to make it on foot as the early pioneers did. The directions said she was about an hour by horseback from Douglas, and that was the nearest shopping and church. He was sure it would be strange not being able to attend church every week as he had since birth, but perhaps there were enough settlers in the area to start a small weekly Bible study with just a few people. He'd happily arrange such a thing if it was possible. All through the long days of travel, he read as much as he could. If it was light out, there was a book on his lap. He'd splurged and purchased 3 new books before his journey, and he was excited to read them. He had spent most nights back in Beckham, reading over a dim light. Reading through the natural light coming in the windows was so much nicer. He spent time looking out the windows as well, watching the landscape change and become more and more sparsely populated. He switched trains in Chicago, and then he was on his train bound for Wyoming and his new home. The journey was made more pleasant by the fall colors flying past his window. The beauty of the season was not lost on him. When he finally arrived in Douglas, he went to the mercantile and found a pretty necklace for his bride. He wanted to let her know that he'd been thinking of her the whole trip out, and he was thrilled to finally be able to marry her and help her with all she needed. And children. He'd craved children since the next generation had started to be born in his family, and he wanted half a dozen. His younger siblings were still monsters in his opinion, but his nephews and nieces were being raised right. His siblings had all learned not to let their children run wild as their parents had. With the directions firmly in his mind, he started the trek to Ruth's ranch. He was very excited to have the opportunity to work outside. He couldn't even express it. Even the days when he'd been penned up in the train had been too much for him. He rode to the north as his directions had said, and he followed the left fork in the dirt road. Life here was already very different from Massachusetts, and he couldn't be happier about it. When he spotted the sign for the Arbuckle Ranch, he stopped for a moment to look around him. The fences needed work, he could see that already, and there were 2 men on horseback not working, just chatting with one another. That would have to stop. Some chatting was fine, but he sat there for over 15 minutes, and the men never budged, obviously not worried about the work they should be doing. Sebastian clicked his heels and moved up the dirt road toward the ranch house. He wasn't certain the men had even noticed him. What if he was a cattle rustler? He shook his head, planning to talk to Ruth as soon as he got there about what he'd seen. The foreman was obviously not only pocketing money, but he wasn't being a good boss either. So many changes needed to take place, and he knew he was going to have to be the one to make them. When he reached the end of the path, he stopped and looked at the beautiful house in front of him. It was 2-story, and he counted 3 chimneys. That meant Ruth was used to wealth, and he was sure her income was rapidly disintegrating. He was going to make things better. By Christmas. Because Christmas was the best day of the year, and he couldn't think of anything better to give her as a gift. He dismounted, tying the horse he'd purchased in town to the front porch, and walked to the front door. He knocked loudly before removing his hat. He'd seen that everyone else was wearing cowboy hats, and his was more of a banker's hat, so he'd have to get outfitted for the ranch. They'd do that when they went to town to marry. The door was opened by a tiny woman with blonde hair that seemed to be coming out of her bun in 4 different places. Yes? He remembered then that she didn't even know he was coming. Smiling, he said, "My name is Sebastian Miller. I'm here to marry you." Ruth nodded and opened the door wide, showing no emotions over his announcement. "It's too late in the day to go into town and marry. We'll have to do it tomorrow. You'll bunk with the men tonight. Tell them I just hired you, not that you're here to be my husband. Maybe you can see if there's anything to learn that way." Sebastian shrugged. "I can do that. We could do that for a few days even, then I could learn a little more. I can already see several things that need to be changed around here." Ruth looked angry at his words. "I have some tea and cookies made up. Come sit with me, and you can tell me what you think is going on around here. Or not going on, as the case may be." She didn't wait for him to answer, simply walking toward the kitchen and leaving him to follow her. Chapter 2. Ruth was surprised at the man who had been sent to marry her. He was extremely handsome and well-spoken. How had it come about that he needed a place to go? Was it rude to even ask? She needed to know. If he was only after her late husband's ranch, then she would have to send him on his way. She led him to the kitchen and poured tea into 2 cups. She'd been planning to have her tea alone, but getting to know Sebastian would be a good thing. She set some sugar cookies in the middle of the table, and then sat down, waiting for him to do the same. "So, tell me about yourself," she said. "Why did you want to travel across the country to marry? Are there no eligible women near you?" Sebastian shrugged. "None whose fathers would allow me to court them. You see, my siblings and I were, well, untamed is a good word for what we were. We played pranks on everyone we met and were often seen throwing wormy apples at passers-by from the top of the apple trees on our father's farm. I've outgrown all the mischief, but it's hard to outgrow the title demon horde. I've been working in a bank for years now, and I wanted to be able to be outdoors, but I still love numbers. My sister thought your letter was just for me." "Your sister? How did she get my letter?" Ruth was confused. Sebastian laughed. "I guess when I tell a story, I should tell the whole thing. My sister is the matchmaker you sent the letter to." "That makes a lot more sense," she said. "And she chose to send you?" It seemed odd to her that the matchmaker would send her own brother to marry a stranger. Why wouldn't she find a woman for him there in her own town? She said the letter made her think of me, and she tends to draw from her brothers for these things. There are 14 children in our family, so it's just easier. I guess if she finds the right person for the letter writer, then that works." Ruth was skeptical. Lizard breath always finds the right person. She doesn't know how to be bad at something. She's kind of intimidating to have as an older sister. Ruth smiled at that. "My little sisters have said the same of me often. Of course, I don't know why. Tell me about your husband." She took a deep breath. "He was a friend of my father's. We never had much money, and when my father hurt his back and couldn't work for a spell, Melvin, who had asked me to marry him repeatedly, offered to give my family enough money to see them through 5 years if only I'd reconsider. I said yes. It was never a romantic marriage. I never loved him that way, but he was my best friend, and I learned to love him as my partner in life, if not as a man. I do hope that makes sense." "It does. It makes a lot of sense. Are you looking for another marriage like your first? Or do you want a marriage with all the romance that you can find?" Sebastian said a silent prayer that she was looking for love as he was. He hated the idea of being married to someone who only wanted him for what he could do to help her. He wanted the love he'd seen in Elizabeth's marriage and so many others. "I'm not sure. When I first sent that letter, I was determined to never fall in love with whomever showed up at my door, but while I was waiting, well, I'm a young woman, and the idea of actually being in love and having someone love me back sounds good. Who doesn't want someone to look at them as if they hung the moon?" Sebastian felt relief wash over him. The idea of spending the rest of his life in a marriage with a woman who had no desire to love him was not appealing at all. "I guess we'll have to see how it goes then." Ruth nodded, sipping the last of her tea. "The foreman comes by around this time every day. I'm going to tell him you're a new hire, and we'll see what happens. How would you feel about sleeping in the bunkhouse for a week as we determine if he's stealing from me? If you find nothing within a week, then we'll assume he's being honest." He didn't like the idea of waiting so long to marry, but there was little else he could do. "How will I check in with you?" "Write me notes, and leave them under the bush out front." "I'll find them." Sebastian frowned. "What if your foreman finds them first?" "Good point. Come as close to the house as you can without being seen and whistle loudly." "I'll come out. If someone asks, we can tell them that I'm asking how you like the new job." "That would work." All right. He got to his feet. How is the new foreman going to feel if he meets me as we're drinking tea and eating cookies? Sebastian wanted to get to the bottom of things as quickly as possible, and that meant gaining the trust of the foreman. She sighed. I hate subterfuge, but I don't know what else to do in this situation. I think we're doing the right thing. He looked over at his carpet bags. I probably want to leave one of my bags here and just take the other. I don't want anyone to think I came here for a wedding and a new life. Better if it looks like I'm just drifting from place to place. Ruth was relieved at his suggestion. Thank you for being willing to do all this. I know you came here to marry me, and there will be a wedding. I just need to figure this all out first. It would give her time to get used to seeing him around as well. She wished there was a way for them to court, because she'd never truly had that experience, but it was all right. It had to be. Bradley was there a few minutes later. He stepped into the house and then frowned at Sebastian. Who's this? He immediately looked as if he didn't trust the other man. He's a new man I just hired. Sebastian Miller, this is Bradley Cooper. I do the hiring around here. We don't need more men. Sebastian got to his feet. As I was riding past, I noticed the fences needed some serious work. I think if you had one more man helping, you could catch up. Give me a shot. He was willing to do the hard work, but he wasn't sure if Bradley believed something was happening that he didn't know about. Bradley's eyes narrowed. You want to be on fences? No man ever wants to work on fences. I can't imagine why you'd be willing. I'd be happy to be on fences. I just need to make a few bucks and have a place to hang my hat for a while. You look like you come from a city. I'm sure I do. I've been working in a city back east, but I need to get back to my roots. I want to work outdoors again, getting dirty and feeling the sun shine down on me. That's what I need right now, so I think I'm the right man to help you out around here. Sebastian knew his true feelings for needing to work outside came out in his words. They even sounded earnest to his own ears. Bradley snorted. Fine. You're in on a trial basis. Ruth had listened to the whole exchange and was getting angrier by the minute. I think you've forgotten who owns this ranch, Bradley. I want Sebastian to work here, and he will work here. She could tell the foreman was irked by her words, but she truly didn't care. The man was shady and underhanded, but she needed to catch him in the act of stealing from her. Bradley just glared at her for a moment, but then he nodded to Sebastian. Get your gear and let's move. Sebastian grabbed the bag they hadn't hidden in another room and followed Bradley out the door. I appreciate you giving me this opportunity, Mrs. Arbuckle, he said at the last moment, just as she was about to shut the door. Ruth hid her smile at his words. He was a better actor than she'd expected. Just make sure you do the job you've been hired to do, and do it well. I will. You can count on me, ma'am. He walked to his horse and mounted with the ease of a man who had ridden all of his life. His father had only ever owned 2 horses, but they had all been riding as soon as they were big enough to sit a horse. It felt good to be back in a saddle again. Bradley watched him mount and seemed satisfied. He got onto his own horse and led Sebastian away from the main house. The bunkhouse was situated a 5-minute ride from the main house, and Bradley showed him where to store his gear. Sebastian took the opportunity to ask some questions about the setup there. How big is the ranch? 5,000 acres. Bradley answered shortly, not seeming to want to give away much information. Sebastian could see he had his work cut out for him. And how many men does it take to run that? Sebastian pushed. He knew less about ranching than he did about farming, but he was about to learn everything he could. Bradley shrugged. Depends on the quality of the men working for you. I only work with the best, so I can do it with 10 men as well as myself. You make an even dozen men working this ranch. Have you worked here long? Sebastian couldn't help but wonder about the loyalty of a man who would steal from his former boss's widow. What's with all the questions? You from the government? Bradley narrowed his eyes. Not at all. Just curious about my new place of employment. Sebastian vowed to only ask the other ranch hands questions from that point on. Bradley was already getting suspicious. Do you want me to start today, or wait until tomorrow? With the long train ride, he was fatigued, but he'd do whatever was necessary. He had to come across as a good employee so that Bradley would keep him around long enough for him to figure out exactly what was happening on the ranch. Wait until tomorrow, I think. I'll introduce you to the other men tonight. We have supper together out in front of the bunkhouse, and we always talk over supper. Bradley eyed him suspiciously. You look awful tired. I am, but I'll be all right. What time is supper? He pulled his pocket watch out and glanced at the time, realizing immediately it was a mistake. The watch was perfect for working at a bank, but not as right for being a ranch hand. He'd have to be more careful in the future. We eat at 5:30. One of the men stops work a little early every day, and he cooks for all of us. I told Mrs. Arbuckle she should be the one cooking right after the old owner died, but she refused. Told me we could keep doing things the way we always have. Well, you should tell her again. Women need to be put in their place as often as possible. Sebastian didn't believe his words, but he said them just the same, knowing the older man would think that way. Maybe it would help Bradley trust Sebastian more quickly. Maybe I will tell her again. Arbuckle didn't discipline that woman enough. If you ask me, the best way to get a woman to listen is to beat them on a regular basis. Arbuckle didn't agree. Bradley shook his head. Stupid man. Sounds like it. Sebastian unpacked his things, folding up his work clothes and putting them on the shelf above his small bed. He wouldn't have much space, but it would be enough to make it through until the wedding. Well, you finish unpacking, and I'm going to go check on the men. Make sure they got everything they were assigned done today. I'll be here. After Bradley had left, Sebastian stretched out on his bed. The situation was worse than he had thought it would be. Mrs. Arbuckle, Ruth, was stronger than he'd expected, but Bradley just seemed to be downright mean and untrustworthy. It was going to be a long week, and he said a silent prayer he'd get to the bottom of things quickly. Asterisk. Ruth couldn't get her mind off of Sebastian that evening. All she could think about was the way he'd looked at her with his deep blue eyes. The man was, well, he was very commanding physically. She didn't know what else to call it. She was attracted to him in a way she'd never been to Melvin. She felt a pang of guilt for a moment, but the truth was, she and Melvin had never had a physical relationship. On their wedding night, her husband had told her he wanted everyone to think he was a man who could attract a beautiful young woman, and he'd married her just for that reason. He'd never been interested in more, and he'd blamed it on his age. She had no way of knowing if he was telling the truth or not, so she chose to believe him. She liked the idea of cooking and cleaning for Sebastian while he worked on the ranch. It would be a life partnership. As she finished up her supper dishes, she imagined him coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her. How different life could be with a man like Sebastian at her side. Ruth hoped that her dreams could be mirrored by reality. In her bed that night, she sent up a silent prayer, asking God to make Sebastian the man she truly needed in her life. The one who would make her feel better about having basically been sold into marriage to an old man. She'd watched her friends marry men and live happily ever after. She could only hope it was now her turn. Of course, she believed you only got what you worked for in life, and she wasn't sure what she'd done to deserve happiness. She sighed, rolling to her stomach and going to sleep. But not without thinking about the deep blue eyes and dark hair of the man who had come all this way to be her husband. Maybe happiness was possible if you always worked toward it. Chapter 3. Sebastian had all his meager belongings put away before the other men came back to the bunkhouse after their workdays. He was lying on his back on his bunk, wishing he hadn't left the books he'd brought with him at the main house with Ruth. Of course, they may have had the other men raising their eyebrows at him, so it was probably best he had. When the other men came into the bunkhouse, he sat up and studied them. He was introduced by Bradley to the men one after the other. He immediately recognized Jesse and Sam, the two men he'd seen sitting on their horses talking instead of working earlier in the day. The other men looked at him as if he was an interloper. "It's nice to meet you," Sebastian said. Jesse nodded, wiping chewing tobacco from his mouth. "I didn't know we were looking for any new men. My brother would have liked a job." He looked at Bradley to see his reaction. "Mrs. Arbuckle hired him. Said she thought we needed more men." Bradley glared at Sebastian. Sam shook his head. "I think she should have asked you. You could have hired someone who would fit in with us better." He looked at Sebastian. "Looks like he belongs in a city." "That's what I said," Bradley said, shaking his head. "I've been working in a bank back east, but I was born and raised on a farm, and I'm used to hard work. I still help my father with the harvest and planting every year." Sebastian would have been bothered if he'd been there to really work with these men, but he was there to marry Ruth. He had to keep that in his mind. The other men turned away. "What's for supper?" Jesse asked the others. "I think Jason said he was making eggs, fried potatoes, and bacon tonight." "It's his favorite thing to make," Bradley shook his head. "We need to get a real cook around here who will make something else, but no one wants to hire on as a cook." He looked at Sebastian. "You do any cooking back east?" The way he said the last two words made Sebastian want to hit him. He was sick of being looked down on for not being just like the other men, and it was the first day. "Not really. I lived in a rooming house with several other men, and I went to the local diner to get my meals. Sometimes I'd eat with my parents and younger siblings, or I'd go to my sister's house for supper there in town. But usually it was the diner. I can't cook to save my life." Sebastian nodded toward the main house. "What about Mrs. Arbuckle? Why doesn't she cook for us?" He didn't think Ruth should cook for them all, but he knew the other men would warm up to him faster if he seemed to think the same way they did. And he wanted to get all the information he could as quickly as possible, so he could marry the little beauty he'd met earlier. Bradley nodded. "That's what I said." Stupid woman refused. "Doesn't she know she'll never catch another husband that way?" Sebastian asked. "Sounds flighty to me. I asked her if she wanted to marry me after the old man died, but she refused. Seemed to think that she could do better. I don't know how when it's darn near impossible to meet someone living this far out." Sebastian looked at Jesse and Sam. "You two try her out?" "I was thinking of maybe trying to court her myself." "Pretty little thing. Hard to believe she's a widow, so young." Jesse laughed. "I didn't make a play for her, but I see her watching me. All I'd have to do is snap my fingers, and she'd be begging me to marry her." He snapped to accentuate his point. Sam shrugged. "I have a girl down the road. Her pa says I can marry her once I have $100 saved up. I don't care about the widow." They all walked together out to the campfire, where the man they'd called Jason was cooking. It smelled pretty good to Sebastian, but after so many days of meals on a train, he was thrilled to have real food. Sitting around the campfire with a tin plate in his lap, Sebastian ate his fill while listening to the other men chatter. Most didn't pay any attention to him, and he caught different pieces of conversations. "Someone's gonna have to mend that fence out toward the road. 6 heifers got away today, and that's not good right before butchering. Of course, I bet they all went to the Coleman Ranch with just a touch of help." Sebastian kept his head down, his ears peeled for more of that conversation. He ate another bite of potatoes and stuck his fork into his food again. He wanted to look like he was too busy eating to listen. There was a laugh in response. Yeah, old man Coleman is going to owe us a bundle for letting the cattle through there. Bradley, you'd better be splitting the profits equally. Bradley laughed. Like any of you men would know the difference. What about when butchering time comes? You going to pretend we got half what we should again? Yup. Then we'll all split everything up, and we can be on our way. We'll see who is still working for Widow Arbuckle then. Bradley spit into the dirt. Sebastian pretended to hear nothing as he silently ate the rest of the food on his plate before asking for more. He had a pretty good idea of what was going on then. He would go to the main house first chance he got the next day. Maybe he wouldn't have to wait a week to marry her after all. As he finished his third plate of food, Sam said something that surprised him. I plan to keep working for the widow. She pays fair wages. As long as I have enough before we drive the cattle into Casper to get married to my sweet Sue. Jessie laughed. You should set your goals higher than a dirt farmer's daughter. Why? Sam asked. She's perfect. The banter changed, but Sebastian felt that he had more than enough information for Ruth. Hopefully she would see things the same way, and he'd only have to spend one night in the bunkhouse. The other men disgusted him with their dishonesty, and it was obvious they were all in on it together. As he fell asleep that night, listening to the snores of the men from the other beds, he thought about Ruth. The sweet beautiful woman who would soon be his. Asterisk. Ruth was up early the following morning as usual, and she wasn't surprised to hear a whistle from the yard. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried outside. Did you learn something? She asked, not daring to look at Sebastian. No, her attraction to him was strong, stronger than she cared to admit. He nodded, dismounting from his gelding, and standing in front of her. He recounted what he'd heard around the campfire. I'm surprised they spoke so freely with you there, she said, frowning at him. I was too, but I kept quiet and kept my head down. I don't think they remembered I existed. I didn't say a word. Good for you. She bit her lip, thinking about what she'd heard. I think I need to head into Douglas to get the sheriff. We could marry while we were there, if you'd like. She felt her face burning with heat as she said it. What kind of woman asked a man to marry her that way? I'd like that a lot. Do you want to go now? She nodded. Yes, if you'll go to the stable and hitch up the team, I'll get my hat. Sebastian grinned at her. That sounds good to me. He hurried toward the barn, thinking about all the things he wanted to say to her and do to her. They hadn't discussed if they'd be sharing a marriage bed yet, but he knew it would come. She was too, well, she seemed too passionate to not want to share a bed with him. As soon as the wagon was hitched, he looked up to see her hurrying out of the house, holding a hat on with one hand, and carrying a reticule with the other. She was running instead of walking, and her enthusiasm warmed his heart. The woman wasn't one of those ladies who thought she was perfect and needed a man for everything. No, she'd obviously been raised a farm girl, and he couldn't approve more than he already did. He held his hand out to her as he helped her into the wagon, and she smiled at him. I'm not used to having someone help me into a wagon, I must say. He climbed up beside her and reached for the leads. You're not? Your husband didn't help you? She shook her head. Not when no one was looking. If we drove into town, he fawned over me and helped me, but usually he just let me do things on my own. He knew I was raised to be self-sufficient. He thought of the way his own sisters were and nodded. I can understand that. My sisters are all pretty self-sufficient. Well, not the little ones, but the older ones. How many siblings do you have? She asked. She knew he'd told her, but she just couldn't remember. 13. And I'm right smack in the middle. He laughed when her jaw dropped. Now you know why I was eager to get away from Massachusetts. It was hard to find someone to marry when I was related to the whole town. I have 3 younger sisters, but no brothers. That's why it hit us so hard when my pa hurt his back. She smoothed out a crease in her dress, realizing just then she probably should have put on her Sunday best to marry in. Of course, he was wearing work clothes, so it must not matter too terribly much to him. Do you want a church wedding? Or would you be happy just going to the courthouse? I'd rather get married by a pastor, but I don't care if it's in a church. I've gone to church my whole life, and I hate that there isn't one closer to us. She frowned. There are a couple of other families that I think would like to have services. He grinned. I was hoping I could put something together with other families once I was here. Would you mind? She shook her head. Not at all. I'll take you around to meet everyone sometime soon. I'd say this weekend, but I don't think anyone will be working for us, and you're going to have to pull double duty. She sighed. I'll see if I can hire some men while we're in town today. Surely there'll be someone around needing a job. He looked over at her. Unless you want me working all the time. She shook her head. Not at all. I'd love it if you worked 5 or 6 day weeks and had time to rest on Sunday. I'll try for that then. I'm sure we can find someone to pick up the slack firing all the men will cause. He rubbed the back of his neck. There's one man that seems loyal to you. Sam. She pursed her lips. But he didn't come to me when he knew the others were stealing. She shook her head. No, I don't want him around any more than I want the other men. He needs to move on. I can understand that. In a way, Sebastian felt sorry for Sam, but in another, he completely agreed with Ruth. Sam hadn't done anything about the men stealing from her, and he'd had every chance to do so. Ruth looked down at her dress for a moment before broaching the subject she was worried about. Do you expect to share a bed with me? Sebastian frowned for a moment. I would love to share a bed with you starting tonight, but I can understand if you feel like you need a little more time. She sighed. I think I do need a little time. How long? A week? I was thinking more like a month. Ruth felt like she was negotiating with her soon-to-be husband for marital rights. Her mother would not have approved at all. 10 days, he asked, grinning at her as he glanced her way instead of watching the road for a moment. He was highly amused at their bargaining. Why don't we say 3 weeks, she asked, seeing the humor in the situation. I'll agree to 2 weeks, but I get to try to convince you to go to bed with me whenever I want. He wanted to pull her into his arms right there and then, but he had a feeling she'd protest, and he didn't want an unwilling woman in his arms. She thought about it for a moment. I think that's fair. 2 weeks, and you can try your best to convince me to share your bed sooner. Well, you'll share my bed. I'm not moving out of the master bedroom for you. How many bedrooms are there? I never got a chance to really see the house. There are 5 bedrooms, and a bathroom with a water closet and everything. She loved the bathroom. It had been added after she married Melvin. She'd asked nicely, and he'd frowned at her in disgust, but a few days later, there had been men there to build her a bathroom. Her husband had been extremely generous with her. Sounds nice. I know there's a parlor and a kitchen and a dining room. I usually eat in the kitchen. She shrugged. Seems like too much of a fuss to use the dining room when it's just me. I won't mind eating in the kitchen, he said automatically, not wanting to create extra work for her. I noticed a barn. Do you have milk cows? I have 2. And several chickens. There's rarely a need to buy anything from the store, because we have it all right there at the ranch. I buy flour and sugar, of course. Things like that are necessary, but I keep a nice kitchen garden as well. Her mother had taught her to keep a kitchen garden for any vegetables she'd want to cook, so she'd kept up the habit after marrying. It was something she could be proud of. Sounds like I'm marrying a woman who knows how to work. That pleases me. And I'm marrying a man who knows how to work. Ruth sighed as she glanced over at his profile. The man was altogether too handsome for her own good. Hopefully she'd get used to him soon. Chapter 4. Once they reached Douglas, Ruth and Sebastian went straight to the sheriff, explaining what had been happening and then what Sebastian had heard the night before. Sheriff Jones removed his hat and scratched the top of his head. Sounds like they're dumb criminals. I'll get some men together and go round 'em up. Thanks, Sheriff. Sebastian looked over at Ruth. Now we need to get married. He couldn't wait to give her his last name and agree to spend forever together. Ruth felt nervous, her stomach doing flip-flops. Right now? She wasn't certain she was ready to marry immediately, even though she'd said she was. You said today was good. It's today. Sebastian took Ruth's hand in his, pulling her out of the sheriff's office to the street where he could speak to her privately. Do you not want to get married? He couldn't bear the idea of her backing out now. He'd come too far for that. He didn't want to have to go home to Beckham and beg for his job back. I do. I'm nervous. She felt silly admitting it so freely, but what else could she do? Let's go to the parsonage. I'm sure Pastor Fott will be there. He and his wife are quiet. They rarely go anywhere. She had fond memories of both of them growing up. I didn't know you'd been to church here enough to know that about them, Sebastian said. He was happy to know she was a church-going woman when she could be. He couldn't imagine marrying someone who wasn't a believer. My parents lived just outside town. I've been a member of the congregation here since I was a little girl. Ruth took the arm he offered her and pointed out the right direction to get to the parsonage. Pastor Fott has been the pastor here for my entire life. I've never known another man of God. Really? That's a long time for a pastor to serve one congregation. We had at least 4 pastors growing up. Of course, when each one left, they tended to blame me and my siblings. She grinned. You really must have been a handful. Oh, we were the worst. We never kept a teacher longer than a semester either. Our parents should have disciplined us, but I think they were just too tired. Sebastian shrugged. He wasn't going to lie to her about how he'd been raised. Too tired? Ruth asked with surprise. My mother always had jobs outside the home, because one of us would always get hurt, and we'd owe the doctor. He shook his head. Or she'd have the next baby, and we'd owe the midwife. It was always something. I see. So, who was home with the children all day? My eldest 2 sisters. Susan and Elizabeth. They hated to have to watch us, but they did it. Susan decided to leave the day the twins painted the cow purple. Elizabeth stayed for a year or 2 after that, but then she moved to town and took over the mail-order bride agency from the woman who sent Susan to Texas. So, your sister Susan was a mail-order bride? He nodded emphatically. Yeah. Only Mary was able to find a husband locally, and I think that was because they fell for each other in school. The rest of us had to go elsewhere. Well, not Elizabeth, but she married her butler, and he wasn't local. Ruth blinked a couple of times. It sounds like someone should write a series of books about your family. It would definitely be an entertaining read. He grinned over at her. Maybe someday someone will write romantic novels about all of us. I see that. She stopped walking and nodded to a house right behind a small church. That's the parsonage. Then let's go get married. He was as excited as she was nervous. Taking her hand, he pulled her toward the house, knocking on the door as soon as he arrived. A small elderly woman came to the door. Hello, Ruth. How are you? I'm good, Ruth said with a smile. This is Sebastian Miller. We'd like to get married if the pastor has time. For you, he always has time, Ruthie. Mrs. Fott opened the door wide. Come in. I'll go get him. The woman hurried from the room. Sebastian smiled at Ruth. Seems like you know them very well. Ruth nodded. Mrs. Fott held a Bible class for young women when I was still unmarried. She would take us on picnics in the summers, and we'd all sit in a circle reading passages. I feel particularly close to her. Before Sebastian could respond, Mrs. Fott was back with a tall, slender gentleman in tow. He walked over to Ruth and Sebastian. Ruthie, are you sure you're ready to marry again so soon? I know you've had a hard time of it since Melvin's death. Ruth frowned, not sure how he'd know such a thing, but she didn't ask. I'm certain. After the ceremony, I'd like to talk to you about men in town who might be willing to come work for the ranch, Sebastian said. He didn't want to go into more detail at the moment, but he knew the pastor would have the knowledge of who was good to hire. Of course, we'll talk. Pastor Fott frowned for a moment. I guess we should get started then. 20 minutes later, they were married, and the pastor invited them to kiss. Ruth hadn't thought about her first kiss with her new husband being in front of the pastor and his wife, though her first kiss with Melvin had been. What was it about her and marrying men she barely knew? She looked up at Sebastian with wide eyes, wondering for the umpteenth time what it would be like to kiss him. Sebastian saw the nervousness on her face, and he gave her a brief kiss, brushing his lips softly against hers and then straightening. Thank you, Pastor. Just the brief touch had his body alive with excitement. He needed to put his mind on something else. The pastor nodded. You're welcome. Now let's talk about men in town who need jobs. He led them into the kitchen and sat at the table, making a list of the men he thought would be good, and putting an address next to each name. This last man, Gus, already has a job, but it's not really a good fit for him. I think he'd do better working for you. What's he doing? He makes deliveries for the store in town, and he cleans up after close. He's a man who needs to spend most of his time outdoors, working with animals, I think. I'd make sure you talk to him. Is he married? Sebastian asked. He really would prefer the men he hired to be bachelors. It wouldn't be good if he separated a man from his family, and the ride into Douglas every day would be too time-consuming. He's not. None of the men on my list are. I thought you'd like it better that way. Pastor Fott looked at Sebastian. Am I right? Yes. I wouldn't want to take a man away from his wife and children. The pastor smiled. He looked over Sebastian's shoulder at Ruth for a moment. Take good care of our girl there. She's special. Sebastian nodded very seriously. I've noticed that about her, and I promise she will be cherished the way a woman should be. The pastor's eyes held a sparkle and his gaze softened as he looked at Sebastian. That's what I want to hear. He looked at Ruth and spread his arms wide, closing them around the young woman as she walked into them. Already married twice, and you're so young. I hope this one makes you happy. If not, he'll have me to answer to. Sebastian smiled at that. The man must be at least 80, and he was frail and thin. Sebastian was at the prime of his life, and he was muscular from so many hours spent helping his family in the fields on the weekends. I will turn myself over to you if I don't make her happy, sir. Ruth hugged the old man tightly. Thank you for marrying us. I'm so glad I got to see you. You could try to come to church, you know, Mrs. Fott admonished. We'd love to see you more often. Ruth smiled. Now that I have a husband who cares to go to church, we might try to make it in once a month. He's thinking about starting a Bible study in our area. Are you now? The pastor positively beamed at Sebastian, obviously thrilled to know that Ruth's new husband was a believer. I have some books with biblical commentary that might be useful. What book would you like to study? Sebastian rubbed the back of his neck. I really haven't thought that far ahead. He wished Ruth hadn't brought it up, but it did seem to make the pastor happier with Ruth's new marriage. Let me loan you something on the first 4 books of the New Testament. I think studying the gospel is the most important thing a man can do with his family. He slowly walked out of the room, leaning heavily on his cane, and Sebastian followed him to get the book from him, not wanting him to have to walk all the way back into the parlor. He was obviously not feeling great. I will happily take your advice. I only have a lifetime of attending church as knowledge. I would love to be able to take a more active role in the community as a Bible study leader. Ruth thinks there are a few families who would like to participate. Sebastian accepted the book the older man took off the shelf and handed to him. Thank you so much for your help. He glanced down at the book in his hands, surprised at the weight of it. Why the 4 Bible books they talked about weren't this wordy? Thank you. The pastor looked toward the door, before lowering his voice. Ruth didn't have an easy time of it with her first marriage. I hope you'll be good for her. I will do my best to be the husband she needs. He felt like there was something he wasn't being told, but he was afraid to ask. Besides, he wanted to learn all he could from Ruth herself, not from the pastor. The pastor patted his arm. I think having the desire to do what's right will carry you far. He settled into an overstuffed chair and closed his eyes. Tell my wife I'm taking a nap until supper, would you? Sebastian smiled. I'll do just that. He was always amused by little old men who slept the day away. He was glad the pastor had time to do just that. When he got back into the parlor, he relayed the message to the pastor's wife, while he watched her exchange a meaningful look with Ruth. Are you ready? He asked his bride. Ruth hugged the older woman before nodding. Absolutely. And we're going to need to go to the diner in town for lunch. I'm famished. You should stay for lunch, the older woman said. We've already eaten, but I'll whip something up in a jiffy. Ruth was the one to shake her head. No, thank you, Mrs. Fott. You've done so much already. We'll just head to the diner, and I'm sure there'll be something delicious waiting for us there. Come back soon, dear. The look Mrs. Fott gave Ruth made her tear up. We will. I love you. The words weren't easy for Ruth, but she gave them freely to the older couple who had always meant so much to her. They were the grandparents she'd never known, and she loved them both dearly. As soon as they were on the sidewalk in front of the parsonage, Sebastian smiled down at Ruth. They're really nice people. They're amazing. My parents came out here to Homestead before I was born, and my grandparents stayed back east. I've always looked at the Fotts as if they were my grandparents. I love them more than I can express. Especially after the trouble with my parents. Sebastian frowned. There was trouble with your parents? Ruth bit her lip for a moment, knowing he needed to hear the entire story, but not feeling up to telling it there on the street. Let's go find ourselves some lunch, and we'll talk while we eat. She wanted to make him wait to hear it, but it was time. They were married now, and he needed to know how she'd ruined the relationship with her parents. All right. He offered her his arm, and she pointed out the way to go. Douglas was a small town, and he was already learning where everything was very quickly. When they reached a small diner next to the train depot, they walked inside. Is this place good? He asked. The smell was absolutely delicious. I've only been here once, so I'm not one to ask. I'm sure it is. They're always busy. It was after 1 in the afternoon, and the place was still half full, which surprised him. The diner in Beckham had always cleared out by about 1. They moved to take a table near the front, so they could watch passers-by on the busy street. I'm surprised Douglas is this busy. It's the train. With trains coming into town so often, people stop here to eat. It's brought economic prosperity to the area. All except for the farmers. The farmers would always be poor, it seemed. She wished things were different, but it seemed to be the farmers' lot in life. They both ordered the specials of the day, which ended up being fried chicken and mashed potatoes with green beans. As soon as the waitress walked away from the table after filling their coffee cups, he looked at her. "Tell me what happened with your parents." Chapter 5. Ruth sighed and looked down at her hands. "I believe I told you my father was hurt, and that's why I ended up married to Melvin." "Well, there's a bit more to the story than that. My parents were certain they could make it even without my father working, and they tried. Mama got a job in town, and she worked 7 days a week, while I took care of the house and my younger sisters. I cooked the meals and did all the cleaning, as well as working in the fields with my younger sisters. I also took care of my father, who was bedridden. Melvin came by every Sunday and asked me to marry him, and my parents always said that I couldn't do that. They didn't want me selling myself into marriage to keep them fed." Sebastian nodded, feeling a little better about her parents. With as poor as he'd grown up, his parents would never have let one of his sisters marry just to get money. Good. About 3 months after my father's accident, I was in the yard collecting eggs when a man rode onto the farm. He wanted to see my father, but he was napping, so I fibbed and said he wasn't home. He told me to tell my father that if he hadn't caught up on the mortgage by the end of the month, the bank would have to repossess the farm. She shook her head. "I knew there was barely enough money to get the flour we needed, and there wouldn't be a new crop for months, if my sisters and I could keep it watered and weeded, and we were wearing ourselves out trying." She sighed. "When Melvin came by that Sunday afternoon, I told him I'd marry him if he'd make sure my family was taken care of. He walked into the house, dropped cash on the table, and promised me he would send them more money every month for 5 years. My mother told me if I went with him, she'd wash her hands of me. She wanted me to marry for love, you see. Just like she had." "And you didn't care to marry for love?" Sebastian asked with surprise. He knew most women dreamed of being married to handsome men who swept them off their feet, not old men who could care for their family financially. He found his respect for her growing by the minute, though. "Well, I wanted to marry for love, but I understood it might not be possible in my case, and more importantly, I wanted my family to be all right. I haven't seen or spoken to them since that day." She shook her head sadly. "I miss them every day, but I know Mama wants nothing more to do with me, and my father was yelling at me from his room. 'Don't you leave with that man.' I'd always obeyed them until that day, but I was 16, and I was old enough to marry. So, I did." She bit her lip, trying not to cry as she recounted the story. It was hard to talk about, even after so much time passing. Sebastian covered Ruth's hand with his. "I thought your father and Melvin were friends." She nodded. "They were friendly. I guess acquaintances would be a better word. And he'd expressed interest in me to my father many times, but my father always told him that his daughter wasn't going to marry an old man." Ruth shrugged. "I married an old man, and I can't make myself regret doing it either. I hope you know that your parents didn't mean it. You could go see them tomorrow, and they'd forgive you." Sebastian knew parents only wanted what was best for their children. They'd loved her enough to not want her to get them out of trouble. They had to love her enough to forgive her for doing what she felt was right. They didn't come around even after Melvin died. I hoped to see them at his funeral, but they weren't there. I asked around about them to make sure they were still in the area, and they are. They just don't want to have anything to do with me." She looked down at her hands, feeling like she was baring her soul. No one else had heard the story from her this way. Only Melvin knew how hard it had been for her, and they'd never spoken about it. She'd tried to bring it up a few times, but he'd shaken his head and told her she was a wife now. She needed to stop dwelling on being a daughter. Sebastian sighed. "I'm so sorry. You did everything you could for them, and they aren't treating you right. But I was a disobedient daughter. Do I even deserve to be treated well? She took a sip of her coffee and stared out the window for a moment. I'll be a good wife to you. She didn't promise to be obedient, because she couldn't. If a similar situation were to come up and her working would keep him from starving, she'd do it in a heartbeat. And I'll be a good husband. And he'd help her make amends if it was the last thing he did. She smiled at him. Thank you. Their food was put in front of them then, and they were both quiet as they began eating. The food was really good, much better than he'd had at a diner before. This is good. He was both surprised and thrilled. He could have eaten there every day without getting bored with the food. It hadn't been the case with the diner back in Beckham. She smiled and nodded. This is where my mama worked when my dad was hurt. She always said the food was really good. She was right. Was your mother a good cook? He asked. Best cook around. She tried to teach me and my sisters, but I was never any good at it. I got better when I had to cook when she started working, but I always felt like I was failing. She shrugged. I'm sure it was because I was comparing myself to her. I'll let you know when you start cooking for me. That'll be soon, right? I'd offer to cook, but I have no idea what I'm doing. My parents were very rigid in how they did things. The girls learned to cook, sew, and clean. We boys worked outside with our father. We were all girls, so we all learned inside chores mostly, but when Papa was hurt, we all started chipping in outside. I mean, I'd always gathered eggs, and I did a lot of the milking, but the planting was my dad's job. I helped my mother with the kitchen garden, but that was about it. And now you keep a kitchen garden. He smiled. Is there anything we need from the store while we're in town? You need a new hat to replace that ridiculous banker's hat. And we need to visit the men Pastor told us about. I could use some more sugar and flour, and maybe some fabric to make you a few new shirts. You need them. Ruth wasn't about to mince words. She'd given that up when she'd married Melvin. I don't. I have perfectly good shirts. Perfectly good shirts for working in a bank. She nodded to the shirt he was wearing. You put that on to work on the ranch all day today. It would have been snagged by a tree and torn before the day was out. I'll make you some shirts that will last. Sebastian smiled. Already taking care of me? I'll be a good wife, Ruth said again. I know you will. 2 hours later, they'd purchased what they needed and hired every man the pastor had put on his list. The last man they spoke with, Gus, agreed to go out the next day. You've just offered me my dream job, sir. He grinned at Sebastian as if the other man had offered him $1,000. Sebastian shook his hand. I appreciate you being willing to come out and do the job. There's more than enough work for you. I promise. Gus nodded. I'll be there first thing in the morning. He rubbed his hands together with excitement. Now I just need to finish my deliveries for the day, and I'll be all yours. As they drove back out toward the ranch, they passed the sheriff and several men, leading the former ranch hands away, all of them handcuffed. Sebastian nodded to the sheriff, and he put his arm possessively around Ruth's shoulders so the men would know that she was his. They didn't need to be getting ideas about his beautiful bride. Not ever. At the house, she went inside to start supper while he carried in the supplies. Most of the men would be there that evening to start working. He'd even made sure at least one of the men could cook so all of their meals would be taken care of, and Ruth wouldn't need to cook for the hired hands. As soon as everything was inside, he frowned at her. I hope the men are here bright and early tomorrow, because we need to get this ranch in tip-top shape. The men said something about driving the cattle into Casper for sale? Yes, that's what Melvin did the last week of October every year, so you'll need to do that in about 2 weeks. She looked at him and bit her lip. Is it asking too much to have you do that so soon? Sebastian shook his head as he took a drink of the glass of water she'd handed him. Not at all. I came here knowing you needed a husband willing to work the ranch, and I'm that man. I'll get the men started tomorrow, and then tomorrow evening I'll look at the books. I don't want to have to do that on my wedding night. He set the glass down and caught her hand, pulling her toward him. When I read your letter, I expected to come out here to meet a woman who was horribly unattractive. I couldn't figure out why you couldn't find a man here. He was surprised men hadn't been pounding on her door for both her beauty and the prospect of owning her ranch. I knew lots of men here. I just didn't trust them. She looked up at him through her lashes. Does that mean you don't find me horribly unattractive? He laughed. I think you're the most beautiful woman I've ever met. And I really want to kiss you now that we're alone together. What do you think? You all right with that? He hesitated before kissing her, wanting to be sure she was comfortable with his touch. Scaring her right off was not the way to get close to her. She nodded. I did say you could try to persuade me into your bed. What better way is there to do it? He cupped her face in his hands, staring down into her eyes. I hated that our first kiss was in front of the pastor and his wife. I should have kissed you before we left this morning, just so our first kiss could be perfect. Let's declare this one our first kiss then. She and Melvin had kissed once, at their wedding. They'd never kissed before or after, which had made her happy. Now she wished she had a clue how to kiss a man, but hopefully Sebastian would teach her. He lowered his head and gently brushed his lips across hers. His arms wrapped around her, and he pulled her closer against him, deepening the kiss. His tongue traced the outline of her lips, and he stroked his hand up and down her back. When she responded to the kiss, he pulled her even closer, his hands roaming up and down her back, one daring to touch her bottom. Ruth lost herself in the kiss, but as soon as his hand touched her backside, she jumped back. You can't do that. What was he thinking? Why not? I'm your husband. If I can't do it, who can? That's only supposed to happen in the marriage bed. Not while we're standing in the kitchen. She couldn't believe he didn't know that. Did his parents teach him nothing? He grinned at her. How am I going to convince you to go to the marriage bed with me if I can't touch you in the kitchen? She shook her head, her face beat red. I'm not ready for that kind of familiarity with you. She took a step back, but she wasn't certain she was telling the truth. His hand on her bottom had felt, well, nice. That's too bad, he winked at her. I'm going to go and milk the cow and gather eggs. Or do you gather them in the mornings? I usually do both. Some of the chickens lay early in the morning and some lay in the afternoons. Then I'll gather eggs while I'm milking. He surprised her by kissing her again quickly before leaving. You need to get used to my kisses, Ruth. They're going to be frequent. Ruth stared after him as he left, her fingers against her lips. If he was going to be kissing her frequently, would she get all shy and confused each time? She certainly hoped not. She'd always been one to have her senses firmly around her. No man should be able to take them from her so easily. When Sebastian came in again a while later, he set a pail of milk on the counter, and a basket of eggs beside it. Anything else I can do? She shook her head. No, your real work will start tomorrow, when the new men arrive. I believe there are several fences that need mending, and I know there are a million other things to do. Melvin used to talk about work all the time, but I'm afraid I didn't listen well. I'll figure out what to do. Maybe on Sunday morning, you could take me to visit the other families in the area you think would like to join my Bible study. I'll ask them ranching questions and invite them to come over. You won't mind if we do it here, will you? Ruth shook her head. I think it's a wonderful idea. I can't wait to start learning about the Bible again. I really miss going to church every Sunday, but Melvin was never a man who cared to go to church often, and I was always afraid to run into my family if I went alone. We'll go together sometime. I'd love to meet your family. Ruth pursed her lips. She had a feeling he was going to be very disappointed if he ever did meet her parents. I didn't get around to baking fresh bread this morning, but I have some left from yesterday. I'll have to serve that, and I'll make fresh in the morning. Sounds good to me. What are we having? Just a simple stew. I don't have time to make anything fancy tonight. That's just as well. If you start cooking fancy meals for me, I might just have to fall in love with you. Sebastian winked at her when she looked at him in surprise. Well, we can't have that. I wouldn't know what to do if a man was in love with me. He laughed. I can show you if you'd like. She shook her head at him. You're going to be a handful, aren't you? Probably. I can't help it. Being a member of the demon horde has ruined me for life. I certainly hope that's not true. She took 2 bowls down from the cupboard, and he took them from her to put them on the table. Then she pulled spoons out of the drawer, and he put them on the table as well. Sebastian, you should sit. This is women's work. Yes, it is. But I don't mind at all. I'm going to be eating the food you fixed, so I should help you serve it. Right? Ruth frowned. No man had ever said that to her. Her father had certainly never helped set the table, and Melvin had only bellowed if it wasn't already on the table when he came in at the end of the day. He was happy to support her, but only if she held up her end of the bargain and had a hot meal on the table every evening. It might be best if you just sat down. Why? I really don't mind helping. It doesn't feel right. I'll get it. Would you like coffee, water, or milk with your supper? She asked. Milk. I don't like to drink coffee late into the day. It keeps me awake. That's fine. After I finish the supper dishes, I'll show you around the house. I just realized that you moved in, and you still haven't even seen your bedroom. And half of my clothes are still in the bunkhouse. He shook his head. I should ride out there and get them before bed tonight. I guess I could do that while you wash the dishes. Or we could ride out together. She shook her head, frowning. I don't ride. My parents didn't think it was ladylike, and I never asked Melvin. I'll teach you. You will? She looked at him in surprise. It's probably not a good idea. Mama said it would make me want things that girls don't need to be wanting. Like what? He asked. I have no idea. She never told me that. Probably that I'd want to be able to do everything boys can do. She shrugged. It's best if the men don't see me riding a horse anyway. He shook his head. If you want to learn, you should learn. I'll leave it up to you, though. She smiled at him. You really wouldn't mind, would you? No, I wouldn't. And I really don't care what the men think. They're here to work and earn a wage, not pass judgment on my wife. Ruth felt like she was free. While she'd been married to Melvin, she'd felt like she had to keep up appearances and always be a perfect lady. Now, though, the freedom to do what she liked felt a bit intoxicating. True freedom was being able to ride a horse in her mind. She'd decide later, but for now, she would just admire the man she was married to. Sebastian was a good man.